Welcome to the Almanac podcast. My name is Christine Gelineau, and I'm the author of Almanac, A Murmuration, published by Excelsior Editions of State University of New York Press. For those who might be wondering, a murmuration is that phenomenon where a congregation of individual birds bursts into the air in fluid, swirling patterns that form, dissolve, reform, reverse, dip, and rise, describing with the path of their flight the air currents and their own acrobatic abilities. My book, Almanac, is a memoir that is held together by that thread of autobiography, but that along the way engages with a good many issues, a murmuration of topics, one could say. Almanac considers the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories we fashion about how we matter as a nation, and the stories we weave about our relationships with other than human animals, and with the endangered natural world we are a part of. And it does so within the framework of the seasons, within the context of the beauty of this world. In keeping with the wheel of the seasons that helped to organize this book, I plan for 4 podcasts, one each at the spring equinox, the summer solstice, the autumnal equinox, and the winter solstice. In each episode, I'll be hosting guests whose own interesting projects intersect with one or more of the themes within Almanac, for what we hope you'll find to be an engaging conversation on that episode's topic. Thank you for joining us today. This is episode 3 of the Almanac podcast, Autumnal Equinox 2025. I'm Christine Gelineau, and today I'm happy to be hosting novelist and photographer Jeff Talarigo. Jeff's empathetic and deeply layered novels have been recognized with the American Academy of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Award and a fellowship at the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Jeff's 3 novels to date are The Pearl Diver, The Ginseng Hunter, and In the Cemetery of the Orange Trees. Born and raised in Pennsylvania, between 1990 and 2006, Jeff spent extended time living in the Gaza Strip, and he lived for some years in Japan, where he taught English, began writing fiction, and met and married his wife. Currently, Jeff lives and works in California, focusing much of his photography skills to capturing the beauty and serenity of the 3 national park sites within range of his home: Muir Woods National Monument, Point Reyes National Seashore, and the iconic Yosemite National Park. Welcome, Jeff.
Well, thank you for having me, Christine. It's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me. It's great.
So I wondered, Jeff, if you'd start us off by reading that first full paragraph on page 135 of The Cemetery of the Orange Trees.
Sure. It is the day before the beginning of summer vacation, when the school children will begin to visit in larger numbers. I make myself as inconspicuous as possible and try to figure out who the unseen penmate was that I spoke with last night. There are not the cows that many are the possibilities, I figure. Judging by the voice alone, I quickly eliminate the 2 cows and the giraffe. Whoever heard of a cow or a giraffe with a gentle, soft voice? Even more so, whoever heard of a cow or a giraffe walking with such quiet steps? I admit that I have never met a giraffe before, but common sense tells me that an animal that large cannot walk or speak as softly as what I heard. Now I have known a few cows and can say with almost certainty that it was no cow that approached me last night.
So I understand our listeners are hearing that passage without any context. So I'd like to provide a little bit of context from my perspective, and then to hear how it is that you were thinking about the form of this novel as you worked on it. I know that you're a novelist who thinks a lot about and experiments with form that will best convey, the narrative that you're striving to enact. I'm not sure you would express it this way, but my sense of the book is that you were looking for a way to give a feeling for life in Gaza without writing a political kind of litany of the woes of Gaza. That's certainly a legitimate goal, but it was being done by others, and it seemed to me that what you were trying to accomplish was to give a complex sense of the emotional lives of people living in Gaza. The passage you just read is in the voice of a sheep who has only just sheltered, you could say, in the Gaza Zoo. Yes, there was a Gaza Zoo. Unfortunately, it survived until 2016. In my reading of it, the Cemetery of the Orange Trees melds more than one approach of how to get a sense of life there. The book came out in 2016, 9 years ago, so obviously well before the crisis that's going on there now. But even then, it was a land in extremity, but full of life nonetheless. And you bring this to life in the book in more than one way. So you have the stories of an American living among Gazans for a limited time, telling stories about that. There's dreams, there's overheard stories. And what struck me most were these invented narratives that remind me of fairy tales, which I mean is the highest form of praise. Enduring fairy tales are stories that are passed down generation after generation, some actually for centuries. And anyone listening to this has likely heard the story of Little Red Riding Hood, as did their own mother and father, their grandparents, their great grandparents, their children will hear it, their grandchildren will hear it. It's a story that's been handed down over so many centuries because it encodes complicated ambivalences children sense about love and power, about the mother upon whom they're so dependent, and whom they understand as sometimes being that nurturing granny and sometimes being the wolf, that terrifying wolf. And similarly, it seems to me your sheep in the Gaza Zoo encodes complicated ambivalences about a place that is both a prison and, in some sense, a sanctuary where people fall in love, bear children, pass on their heritages. The sheep who has escaped first the shearing shed, then the slaughterhouse, and ends up instead in the zoo among the cows, the gazelle, the giraffe. Peaceful animals such as himself takes on a metaphoric role. So am I anywhere near how you were thinking about the form as you were writing the novel?
Yeah, you're quite close. And when you mentioned the word form, it took me 6 years of writing and about 800 pages in the garbage to come to the book where it was published. And it took me 2 years after I found the voice. And the voice I was trying to find was a narrative voice that gave me some distance from the family I lived with. I lived with a family of 14 Palestinians in Jabalia refugee camp on 2 occasions. And obviously, I was quite close to them and quite close to the Palestinian story themselves. And that's what I was looking for, is trying to find some distance in order to tell their story. And for 6 years, I waffled around. I wrote draft after draft and just never felt comfortable that I was telling the story the right way. Didn't have the voice. And then, luckily, one afternoon in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I was living, I used to write in the Coop bookstore at Harvard Square. I wrote there maybe six days a week. And just magically one afternoon, I sat down and I write by hand. And I wrote like a 3,000 word story with a talking goat in it. And, I was a bit anxious about this to send it to my agent at that time because, she's been reading all this stuff for 6 years and I'm going to send this off to her. And she, all you came up with, Jeff, is a talking goat after 6 years. So anyway, I sent the story off to her, and the next morning, she wrote back to me right away and said, Jeff, I think you found it. And so that sort of gave me the confidence to tell the story through fairy tales, as you mentioned, fairy tales, folk tales. And I've always liked folk tales and fairy tales. And before I write any of my books, I always go back in to the country I'm writing about and read their poetry, but also folk tales. And I really think that leads you lends you a really good perspective on the country. So anyway, wrote this story, and then for the next 2 years, I had the center of the story was the Gaza Zoo, and I had various animals talking in the book. The sheep, as I just read. There's a talking goat. There's birds that can talk. Pretty much all the animals. A gazelle, and this just it would just gave me some freedom. I could breathe with telling this story. It gave me some space to tell it. And for me, the narrative distance is really important, especially when you're doing books like I'm doing, which are, based on truth, and you're reworking them into fiction. So the voice was a difficult thing. But once I found that, it still took me 2 years to get it, but I felt very confident that, I could tell the story.
Yeah, I think that the animals gave a sense of intimacy while still having that narrative distance. And I think that they work so well because of that. And when I proposed this interview to you, the question that I emphasized had to do with empathy and appreciation of other cultures versus cultural appropriation. And the reason obviously that I raise this question with you is, you're a white Italian American boy who grew up in Pennsylvania, and your
Mhm.
novels have as protagonists a Chinese, well, I guess he's Korean background, but a Chinese man, a man in
Okay.
China who's a ginseng hunter on the border between North Korea and China. And then the pearl diver, you have a 19-year-old woman in post-World War II Japan. Um, the Cemetery of the Orange Trees, as we said, that's set in Palestinian Gaza. And the novel that you're working on now is from the point of view of Americans and is in Pennsylvania, but it's also not from the perspective of a white descendant of immigrants of your generation. So we'll talk about your latest project in just a moment, but for now, can you fill us in on what gave you the confidence as an author, as an authority, as it is to take on the voices of these characters in Pearl Diver and Ginseng Hunter and Cemetery of the Orange Trees?
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, you got all that information right. There's lots of stuff there that, all these different narratives, but um, it's a good question. I've thought about it many times over the years, and I grew up in a small coal mining town in Pennsylvania, a couple thousand people, as you said. It was all white, no diversity to speak of. I believe in the 100th anniversary of the celebratory book they put out, they said it was 99.53% white. And I don't know where the 0.47 was, to be honest with
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Who that
you. I never
person
really saw
was.
them either. So anyway, I grew up in this environment, and I don't think I was really feeling it as a teenager, what I'm about to say, but I felt trapped. It was inside me, and I felt this deep hunger for diversity, for something different. And I never really found that until I went off to college. I went to Slippery Rock, University of Pennsylvania, um, and I started, seeing the other part of the world, different diverse populations. Even if they were just from Long Island, New York, they were still, for me, diverse. And so that started opening me up a little bit, and I continued this hunger for that. And I started very, very late as a writer. I never read. Most of my friends, like yourself, I'm sure, most of my friends who are writers, they read as children. They read literature all the time. They were great students as far in the English part of it. And I never read. I never read a book of literature until I was about 25.
Mm,
Not a single book.
mm,
And so when I was in my 20s, I was living in Ohio, and I ran into some big problems. My father died, but also my grandfather died at that time, and I had a business that went under, and I was nearly homeless. And I found a reprieve in this one-room library in Peninsula, Ohio. And I went there just to escape people calling and pounding on my door and, coming after me and stuff. So it was a balm for me, just in the sense of getting away from the house. And that's when I started to read. I started reading all the small books that I was supposed to be reading, uh, Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men and George Orwell and all these writers that I never read in high school. And I started reading them, and I worked my way up to the bigger books. But I was, 25. I was going through a really tough time, and I was reading Steinbeck and James Baldwin and Louise Erdrich and George Orwell and Tolstoy. And at this time, I was also really developing, maybe even late in my life, my moral compass. And I think reading these writers and sort of developing my moral compass as a 25-year-old rather than a 15-year-old high school student doesn't really get everything they're reading. These books really spoke to me at that time in particular. And then I went, I was a journalist a couple years later down in DC. And then I went to Gaza in 1990. That was the big thing in my life. That was the turning point of my life that really taught me about empathy and really, really focused my moral compass. And it was there in Gaza that I decided that I wanted to be a novelist rather than a journalist. And I've not turned back. So I've been writing novels since, since I was 32. So like 32 years now.
Right.
So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's, um, in my book, Almanac, which is not fiction, it's a memoir slash meditation is how I think of it. Um, it's, I consider it nearly as much a memoir of place as of my own biography.
mm,
And in particular, the two areas where that I've had the longest association with, that being Mashpee, Massachusetts, and the area in upstate New York where my farm is. It falls within the area where the Haudenosaunee village of Anaquaga
mm,
existed as a settlement for well over a century before its destruction in 1778 during the American Revolution. So, how to tell that history of
mm.
those places from a perspective that included the views of the Wampanoags and the Haudenosaunee was a question of, real concern to me. And I like to hear about your novel in process, whereas Authenticity and Pearl Diver would owe much to your years of you lived in Japan for years. How many years did you live in Japan?
Yeah, 15 years.
Yeah, you lived in Japan for 15 years, and your protagonist, 19-year-old woman, but she is of the same, I presume she'd be approximately the same generation as your in-laws, as your
Yes.
wife's,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
So that,
absolutely.
you had sort of an intimate connection to it in that way. And Cemetery relies on your two extended stays in Gaza. With your current project, your setting is in Pennsylvania, where you grew up, but there's no way for you to go and live among the students of the Carlisle Indian School that operated at the end of the 19th century, very early years of the 20th century. So I was hoping you'd tell us a little bit about your work in progress. And if you could, I wonder if you find is the research something like your research for the Carlisle Indian is closer to the kind of research I needed to do for the Wampanoags and the Haudenosaunee for my book. And I'm wondering how different that felt from the kind of research like when you're living in Gaza with the family in Jabalia. Uh,
Mm.
what's the difference in that kind of how, I mean, the base of this is, what are your thoughts about how to respectfully write about a culture you don't belong to? How to bring that to life without feeling you're appropriating.
Yeah, yeah, like you just said about what you did. The research is I'm very lucky because I guess about 15, 20 years ago, the Carlisle Indian School, they started putting into archives, digitizing all the records. They have 40 years from 1880 to 1920, all the students' records, health records, attendance records. I mean, everything they digitized all this. And so I'm very blessed in that because I'm here and out in California and I can do all my research from right here. Whereas opposed to when I was living in Japan and I was doing research for a book, I would fly back to Washington, D.C. for like a week, go to the Library of Congress and make like something like 1,000 pages
Mhm.
of photocopies and bring them back to Japan. And this was back in the 90s. And so anyway, the Carlisle Indian School, which is done through Dickinson University in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, they've digitized everything. And they even had a weekly newspaper, which the uh, children wrote, and one of them was called The Red Man. Okay, which is okay, whatever. That was
Right.
the name of it. But it was
Yes,
edited. It was
that's what it
edited
was
and written.
called.
Yeah, that was called, and it was written and edited by the students at the Carlisle Indian School. And all of that's digitized. There's like 40 years of weekly newspapers, photos, and everything I'm doing, the research wise, is just just online here. And so that's been such a gift for me. And I love to do research. I get into that rabbit hole where I just, I get lost for hours and hours and I'm like, geez, I didn't write anything today. I was just doing research. But I love doing that. And that comes from my journalism days as well. I was very lucky as a journalist where I was doing, like long stories that maybe took me 6 months. So I did a lot of research, a lot of interviewing, and that's been, a godsend for me
Mm,
as a novelist. I work the same way.
mm,
So anyway, the book I'm working on now, it's in the second draft, but my drafts, it could be another 100 years before it's done. But I have a um, half Native American, half white woman narrating the story. Her father was a Paiute Indian in the Carlisle Indian School. Paiute Indians are out here in California, over
mm,
near Yosemite. And she is the narrator at this point. So she's never met her father. So everything she is telling in narrating in the story is through second hand, third hand, through her grandmother, what she knew of her father, through her mother, what she knew of her husband, and the girl's father. But also, she's working in the archives as well, and she's discovering her father's story through the archives
mm.
at the Carlisle Indian School. So anyway, she's half Paiute Indian. Um, so this has been interesting for me to work on. I love writing from a woman's point of view. I grew up in a family of women for the most part. I feel much more comfortable being around women. My grandmothers were great storytellers. They were really into the family history. So I've been blessed with that. And so my grandmothers were, I think, the first storytellers in my family. I was the first published novelist, but they were the real true storytellers. And I learned a lot just from their stories, from my Italian side, but also from the Irish and German and Spanish side of my mother's family. And so anyway, I'm working on this as a, point of view from a woman's point of view. And I think the question about appropriation is really a tough one. I've been asked that before, how do you, as an American, you know, or how can you write a book about Gaza or write a book about Japan or write a book about the ginseng hunters in China? But I believe there's a lot of things universal within all of us that sort of lends itself to storytelling. And I think you mentioned earlier myths and folk tales and all of these things, they're through all our cultures, Native American culture, but also, European culture, all over the world, they have these. And I think I'm able to do it through the research. What I'm doing in research is mainly image hunting. I'm looking for images that will fit into my book. And then I start playing with the voice through these images. And hopefully, and again, writing from a woman's point of view, I feel very comfortable from that. My first book about Japan is written from a woman's point of view. In the Gaza book, there are some stories, women's point of view. The ginseng hunter has a woman's point of view, part of it. And so I feel very comfortable with this. And she is half me, she's half white American. And she grew up in my book, she grows up on a farm like my mother did. And so it's based on the farm where my mother grew up, which was right across from the railroad tracks. And the railroad tracks, those actual railroad tracks, the Indians, my character came by her house as a young boy going to the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. So that's part of the book as well. So those are
Yeah,
things you can sort of fudge. They did come by train, but, did they come by, this woman's house? Sure. In my book, they did.
right, right.
So,
Yeah, but I'm interested, the way that you found, once again, form by your protagonist discovering her father's story through research when that's how you're uncovering the story also.
yeah,
And I'm also interested that to me, place is so crucial, and I'm so connected to that idea of place. And I noticed that you're using both the farmland where your mother grew up, the land where you grew up, and then also the landscape where the Paiutes came from, that was
right.
lost when you went to Pennsylvania, but is where you spend so much time now. Uh,
Sure.
with Yosemite, that, a real connection there. So to me, that shows a kind of respect for that you need this deep down internalized knowledge of the landscape that produced the culture that you're trying to, purvey to convey.
Mm.
Uh, to me, that shows a respect um, for that, rather than it's not that you're not trying to appropriate, you're trying to connect to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, your point there about the connection out here in California, because in a few weeks from now, I'll be in the Eastern Sierra hiking for 2 weeks. And I am hiking in, a town near a town called Bishop, and the Paiute Nation has a reservation there currently. And so I'm driving through there to go on my hikes, which is, their homeland. And then you have the Shoshone Indians, you have the Miwok Indians who used to be at Point Reyes, where I go often.
Mhm.
And so it's great when I'm hiking these trails, and I do a lot of hiking at night. I feel close to these characters. I
Yeah.
feel that I'm
Yeah.
walking on in their footsteps and fishing at their lakes. And I think that allows me to make it less feel appropriated, where I'm experiencing their land and, respecting it and understanding it as a white person, that how privileged I am in this country,
Mhm.
and how much damage we have done to these people.
You,
So anyway, it's great. Yeah, and my mother's home, the farm, and I've never been to the Carlisle Indian School, and I don't need to be, because I am, like you said, I'm discovering her father through the archives, and it's as surprising me as it would her, because she's never
mhm.
met her father.
Mhm.
So it's there's a bit of that as well. So all of those things I think help make it more manageable and
Yeah,
make me
well, I
less.
think to me, I feel that it's not possible to just, say, well, I'm white, I'm not that, and I can leave it out. You can't leave it out. That's
No.
not the whole of the story. It needs to be included, but to be included, you need to have those connections. It's like your connection to the lake. You're out there hiking in the Sierras because you want to get the sunrise, and you'll go all this distance with a little headlamp on in the darkness. And anybody who has ever walked in a wilderness area in the darkness by themselves
Mm.
understands that they are connecting. You're
Yeah.
definitely connecting. You're a novelist, but you also have this passion for photography, particularly of the national parks, with an emphasis on those that you've got Muir Woods
Mm.
right close by. Point
Yeah.
Reyes is not far at all, and you make a pilgrimage to Yosemite regularly every year. And you've been sharing your really evocative photos of those special places on social media for some time. And the photos are of such quality that people have been clamoring for you to get them out there and have some of them available for sale. So two things I wanted you to, tell us about the website that you're getting ready to launch in October, in a couple weeks here, for that purpose. And also, given the cuts to the Park Service and the pressure to sell off substantial tracts of public lands, I'd love to hear your take on the importance of the national parks and public lands, what roles those play in American culture and in the inheritance of all Americans, for space for, refreshment and reflection, and making our national history come alive for new generations.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I many of the people I meet on these hiking trips are not Americans. It's quite interesting. I've met
Mhm.
probably 70% of the people I meet in Yosemite and in the Eastern Sierra are people from, I met, South Africans and people from all over the world. And I met an Argentinian couple in Yosemite this, a few months ago. And I happened to see them twice in the same day, even though we were going the opposite way. We ended up meeting up again in the valley, Yosemite Valley that night. And they were there in Yosemite for a week. And of course, they have, Patagonia in their country, as well as Chile's Patagonia. And we were talking, and I said about, oh, I would love to go to Patagonia and how great it is. And they said, hey, this place is amazing. And that made me, feel really great. And we do have incredible national parks that are beautiful and clean. And Yosemite's one of them. It happens to be in, 3 hours from my house. Um, and what's happening now uh, is just horrific, erasing history. I mean, you literally have signs now in these national parks that say if you see anything that's inappropriate about American history, contact us. And they're just literally erasing the history as it happens. And I think just last week in El Paso, Texas, they put an ICE detention center where the Japanese internment camps were back in El Paso, Texas, back in
That's a
1940.
way to keep the history alive.
Yeah, yeah, and again, where I hike, where I'm going to be going in a few weeks, is the Paiute Reservation is only 45 miles away from Manzanar Japanese Internment Camp Museum, and they're right there. And I'm hiking in these areas, and we, as a country, are erasing this. I don't know what's happening at Manzanar. I'm going to go check that when I go to see how much they have, pulled back from that and erased the history of that place as well. But I know the national parks they're doing at Point Reyes, they've had mentions of, anything about the Miwok Indians, the Miwok village there, anything that's negative against this country, should be taken away and the real history should be shown. And to me, that is the most un-American thing you can do, whitewashing your history.
Mhm.
And we need to know, where we came from and what we've done. And
Good and
it,
bad.
yeah, good and bad. And that's it. And that's the same with our family histories as well.
Mhm.
My family, we've had some stuff in the past that's not great, but that's part of who I am, and that's part of who my son is. And I think we need to recognize that. And when the government's doing this and taking over things, and it just breaks my heart because
Mhm.
this is a treasure. I think the national parks and the library system in the United States are two of the great things about this country.
Mhm.
And
They've
but
changed your life for sure.
oh my God, oh my,
Yeah.
totally changed my life. Yeah,
Yeah.
the Peninsula one room library in Peninsula, Ohio, a town of 300
Mhm.
people, totally changed my life and made me become a reader, which led to me becoming a writer. And that may not have happened if that little library was not there in my,
Mhm.
in my backyard.
They talk about libraries opening the world to somebody. It certainly did to you. And
Yeah, and what a gift that was. What a gift. And then I
Mhm.
did a fellowship at the New York Public Library, for a year, another amazing gift. And I teach ESL and I have students from like something like 20 some different countries, and they're always shocked. I had two Japanese students just told me last week they took their kids to the library in Palo Alto and got them library cards, and they said how wonder it was you have libraries everywhere, even small
Mhm.
towns. And our students, my students, the foreigners, come in and they recognize these things in the national parks as well. And these are blessings for us as,
They're a treasure that belongs to all of
yeah,
the
all
American
of us,
people. Yeah,
exactly.
all of us. Yeah.
And
So.
um, and the photography, has become a balm for me as well as Point Reyes and all these places. And they've helped me through some very, very difficult times in my life. And the photography, I started doing this maybe 12 years ago. My son for Christmas bought me a really, really small digital camera, like a really tiny one as a gift. And I started getting into photography after that. And for the past 12 years, I got a really great camera now. And that's always around my neck wherever I go. And
Mhm.
it's a great way of being creative. It's a great way of writing when you're not writing. The writing is always in my head, but I'm being creative looking through the lens, and
Mhm.
that lends itself to my writing as well, and my teaching as well. And all this stuff connects up with me being a teacher as well. I teach you, obviously, with you at Wilkes University, but also I teach ESL, and all these things go hand in hand. So,
So it all makes a whole. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I really, this has been an engaging conversation. I really appreciate your time and your insights, and I'm sure I know our listeners will as well. Thanks to all of our listeners for making time for us. So until next time, this is Christine Gallino along with Jeff Talarico. We're signing off for the Autumnal Almanac episode of the podcast. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And autumn's my favorite season, by the way.
It is a lovely season, yes. So I'm just
Thank you for
going to
having me.
share a few of, if I can get to it here. Where are they? Yes, sorry for that delay, but just a few
Yeah.
resources here of things mentioned in our podcast. If for people that are interested in learning more about some of the things that we've talked about. So I just will leave that screen up for a little bit, and ways to contact and find more information about my book, about Jeff's photography page, about Jeff's books. And finally, some thanks for people that helped us to pull this together. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.